Shah Muhammad II, a man regarded as the second Alexander the Great, was now running like King Darius. It was only a few years ago that a strange group of emissaries with a caravan of spoils from the Far East arrived at the court of the Khwarezmian Shah. They were only in Iran to request peaceful trade relations and trade some gifts. Shah Muhammad did not take them or their so-called Great Khan in any seriousness. Surely the steppe could not be united. So he had the lot of them executed and all of their goods seized. Little did Shah Muhammad know that he had just pissed off the up-and-coming, soon-to-be most powerful empire in the world. And the Mongols always paid revenge back tenfold. Soon enough, just as the Shah and his neighboring king of Georgia were about to come to blows over a border conflict, the Mongols struck suddenly and without regard for life or morality. Possibly hundreds of thousands of Mongolian horse archers flooded into the Khwarezmian Empire. Chinese siege engines, likely the greatest in the world at this point, following just behind them. They turned some of the most prosperous cities in the world to ghost towns. Eventually, they hit the capital, Originz, and utterly exterminated it. Atrocities of war that go unmatched. Shah Muhammad could do nothing but run. He ran and ran until he could simply run no more. The Mongol horses that could seemingly mount the world had one weakness: water. And the salty, undrinkable Caspian Sea was the perfect shield from this wave of terror. The Shah boarded a ship and found a new home on a small island just off the shore. He had escaped the Mongols. He had lived. But conditions on this island were harsh when compared to the naturally air-conditioned palaces of inner Iran. Soon enough, infection had set in. His lungs grew heavy, his breath short, and his heart fast. Shah Muhammad died on that little island. Nearly any hope of restoring the once vast and mighty Khwarezmian Empire died with him. For the sake of driving out these horse lords, the fishermen on that little Caspian island stayed hush on the fate of the Shah, the secret being kept for some time in hopes of restoring the empire under his own son. The notorious Jalal al-Din continued the fight against the Mongols, forced to campaign in the Far East near India as his last holdout. Genghis Khan personally sent two of his most trusted commanders and 20,000 horse archers to locate and bring back Shah Muhammad, dead or alive. Without knowing his fate, these generals began looking east. They heard of a powerful country of mountains made from gold and wine, led by a young king whose might needs no question. Perhaps Shah Muhammad was here. Perhaps he wasn't. The Mongols did not care. The Empire of Georgia was found guilty of being rich and found themselves allies of the Mongols' greatest rival on the steppe. The once all-powerful Cuman Kipchaks and Georgians together were unstoppable, maybe even for the Mongols. And they had been allies for at least 100 years now. Here, with this knowledge afforded to the Mongols by their extensive spy network that couldn't find Shah Muhammad, the Mongolian mastermind of warfare himself, perhaps a greater tactician than Genghis Khan himself, devised a plan so crazy, so extensive, that only he could lead it, and only with one of Mongolia's finest warriors beside him. Subutai and Jebe were the two aforementioned dogs of war, and after careful analysis, they had more plans than just finding the Shah. They requested Genghis Khan if they could lead a reconnaissance quotations, reconnaissance mission across the Caucasus. Through the Kingdom of Georgia and into the steppe with the long goal of opening a new front against the Cuman-Kipchak Confederation and ending their alliance to Georgia. Chinggis granted these two permission, knowing the massive risk but also coherent to the fact that if anyone could lead and complete this daring and downright insane plan, it was Subutai and Jebbe alone. To start with, Jebbe, which translates to arrow, earned that nickname because he shot Chinggis Khan. Yeah, he shot him with an arrow, and he almost killed him. But instead of executing him, Chinggis saw only potential and hired him on the spot. From here, Jebbe quickly rose through the ranks and became the youngest main general in the Mongol army. Jebbe was renowned for his ability to lead men on the front lines. That was his role. And obviously his accuracy on horseback didn't leave him with a nickname for nothing. Jebbe was the general you trusted in the trenches to fight his way out. Then on the equally menacing but far more well-rounded side was Subutai, Chinggis Khan's most senior general who quite possibly was a better strategic mind than the great Khan himself. Subutai ran every aspect of the military with hawk-eyed efficiency, so confident in his logistical expertise that he was willing to cross the expanse of the Caucasus Mountains without a full map. Subutai was to Genghis Khan what Davout was to Napoleon, Antony to Caesar, what Ivan Zakarian currently was to King George Lasha of Georgia. And so, in the fall of 1220, the reconnaissance mission that would go on to be called the Great Raid began, as 20,000 Mongols crossed the border through the lush grasslands of Armenia. With enough fodder to feed their herd, these dogs of war started looting nearby villages, testing to see if this particular king would come to the rescue. Meanwhile, in the Georgian capital of Tbilisi, King George IV Lasha Bagrationi was assembling a massive army. Not meant for the East or the Mongol, but one that would finally march to join the Georgian Christians with their longtime Crusader allies. Yes, the Georgians were about to join the Crusades. But with this alternate history ruined by the Mongols, let's go over exactly what King George may or may not have known about them. The answer is, I don't think he knew enough. Let's not forget about Georgia's own spy network. The Mistovarni, set up by King David IV, was still running, but was obviously complacent or fed some horrible lies. Personally, I don't believe what I'm going to tell you, but I'm going to tell you. Word got out that the Mongols were actually long-lost Nestorian Christians who were here to save Georgia and restore the Christian East, joining the Crusaders along with George Lasha. I mean, they did just crush the greatest Muslim powerhouse in the world at that point in the Khwarezmian Empire. There is some truth in this seemingly otherworldly statement. The Mongols were Christians. I mean, not wholly, obviously, but there were whole tribes of Mongols that were Christians, and I just can't wrap my head around that. And even yet, some were in the Mongolian military high command. Perhaps Mongol spies fed into this, and the Mistovarni got the wrong idea. Prester John was here, and his name was Chinggis Khan. The Mongols weren't invaders, they were saviors. But sure, the Mongols, open as they were not afraid to use religion as a weapon or a shield. And with the Georgians being the religious bunch that they were and still are, he might have just tricked them. What we know that King George knew, at the very least, is that a mystery army, all on horseback, was raiding southeast Armenia. And that did not fly with him. King George Lasha, alongside his childhood tutor and chief officer, Ivan Zakarian, decided to go on their own reconnaissance mission. At this point, the raids in Armenia were so small that King George decided to send some of his massive army back to Tbilisi. Now, with only 10,000 of George's finest, this makes me think that he really had no idea what he was up against. Atabeg Uzbek, one of George's senior governors who never really was loyal to him, knew the kind of people he was dealing with as the Mongols passed through his lands, and he simply retreated west toward his son's hold in Nakhchivan. They plundered modern-day Armenia and Azerbaijan, growing in frequency and ferocity. While most Mongol conquests started with a warm and friendly surrender, or I'll kill everybody, they still offered that surrender as a kindness. No kindness was afforded to Georgia. This was no conquest after all. This was a reconnaissance. Or in other words, the rules didn't apply here. The raids featured babies torn from mothers' bellies, among all that couldn't be worse than that. All this in an effort to anger the short-tempered king into fierce action. While King George likely knew very little about the Mongols, Subutai knew all about him and his empire. He was a man that studied before doing his homework, and he liked to play with his food. He knew George wouldn't let his own people be picked apart by the birds. He knew the weaknesses of the Georgian Empire, its enemies outside and inside. The only thing he did not know was how the Georgian military operated. The Mongols at this point hadn't fought anything of the like before. First of all, this was the Mongol Empire's first invasion of a Christian nation, and these most pious ones were filled with a crusader zeal and really always had that same zeal even before the Crusades started. The Khwarezmians might have been the closest thing, but the Georgian infantry combined with Armenian arrows was a different beast in itself. A stubborn one that found help from various horsemen from their Elenian cousins to Kipchak mercenaries, Circassians, and all the others. There was only one way to test this king, his tutor, and his army. Subutai and Jebe set their trap, and now George and Ivan were walking straight into it. The armies of Georgia stopped a few raids, killed a few of these foes. When they were pushed back, George made the decision to run them out of the country once and for all. Here on the edge of his empire, in the not-so-vast but still extensive arid grasslands of Armenia, Subutai and Jebe introduced George and Ivan to the most used and most effective strategy up the Mongolian war sleeve. As the Georgians gave chase, the Mongols began hit-and-run feigned retreat tactics. God damn it. George, the stubborn king that he was, pushed on, but was soon convinced to retreat himself, perhaps realizing that these men could simply run forever. As he retreated, Subutai really tested the Georgians, and they held their own, with the Mongols taking more than a few casualties from the Kartvelian arrows. Eventually, the battered Georgians made it back to the safety of the mountains provided by the Lesser Caucasus. The Mongols turned back, only to set up camp for winter pastures around the city of Erin, which was near the center of the Georgian Empire and uncomfortably close to Tbilisi. In that great city of the Caucasus was the would-be Crusader army turned Mongolian defense force. King George and Ivan Zakarian went to the drawing board, deciding to hunker down in the capital and recover for the time being. Surely these horsemen couldn't make war in winter. It's not like they were from Siberia or something. And they can't besiege a city like Tbilisi without some infantry at least. While never truly idle for long, Subutai did what he did best in foreign lands. He simply made a mess of the place. He made allies with the Empire's own vassal subjects. Of course, Atabeg Uzbek flipped sides, but for once in his life, he may have resisted this if not for his own son, the governor of Nakhchivan, who submitted to Mongol rule. With these two Aldeguzids went many of the Turkish peoples who had integrated into the Georgian Empire, suddenly rejoining their nomadic brethren. And then the Mongols found a friend in the Empire's Kurdish subjects, which were numerous. With a proper infantry force at their side, Subutai began a surprise march through the mountains of the Caucasus in January. Here they took the lax Georgian garrisons by surprise and picked them off in the January wind. Not only were they ambushing, but they were moving fast. Reconnaissance work paying off, they made it through the maze of drifted mountain passes, and by spring, they were well on their way to Tbilisi. Subutai knew exactly what he was doing, yet again, testing the young King George. King George knew what had to be done more than anyone else in the room. No matter what, if Tbilisi were to not be burned like Khwarezm's capital, those traitorous infantry had to go. King George and his trusted mentor led the men who, at this point, were fighting to save the Crusaders in the Levant out of their ancient capital and toward the Mongolian coalition. They met at the Battle of Sagimi. The Georgians outnumbered their foe, but not by much. Here, they blocked the way to Tbilisi, unmoving, as if they were the walls. The Kurdish and Turkish infantry advanced first, with the Mongols closely behind. As the infantry and cavalry on both sides clashed, the heavily armored Kartvelian infantry made mincemeat, reminding the traitors why they were under the Georgian boot in the first place. The coalition center line broke, man and horse now tucking tail and running. This was their chance to finally catch those damn horse archers. They caught up to them, got a few of them, but eventually, somehow the Mongols regrouped, turned around, and simply let the arrows fly at the disorganized Georgians. Feigned retreat. Got him again. Targeting the cavalry first before closing the flanks and raining down hell on all of them. The king ordered for a retreat, with his bodyguard filling around him, but much of the army was surrounded, deserted, and left for dead in a field of arrows. The defeat was severe. The army was in tatters and needed rebuilt. But King George had done exactly just enough. He had slaughtered the enemy infantry enough to dissuade the Mongols from Tbilisi, this time around at least. Subutai and Jebe turned around, minimal casualties, with not one but two different armies that had potential to block the Mongol army in the passes of the Caucasus. They had killed two birds with one stone, and returned to greener pastures in modern-day Azerbaijan. Like in Aran, the Mongols chose to winter 1221 near modern-day Barda, raiding Shirvan in the meantime. Here, Subutai, who had resisted from targeting large population centers, began offering the cities of Iran, formerly part of the Khwarezmian Empire, the classic, surrender or you all die. He moved up from there until reaching Ardabil and Ganja, cities of the Georgian Empire, who both refused to surrender. Ganja, the city that was a thorn in the side to many a king of Georgia, was sacked in record time, along with Ardabil. The Mongolian reconnaissance force, while perfectly fine still, had lost quite a few men since the start of their great raid nearly 3 years ago. Genghis Khan replenished their 20,000, and with the loot they had already captured and with the promising victory outside Tbilisi, the Great Khan gifted his dogs of war another 10,000 on top of that. Great. 1221 rolled into 1222, and the Mongols emerged from Barda and marched straight toward Tbilisi yet again. Ivan and George, as one last shot, showed the Mongols something they may have never seen before. If these light cavalry could meet only a few thousand of Georgia's equivalent to the medieval knight, the cataphracts would slaughter them. At the Battle of Cunan, the Mongols boldly and rather out of character charged the infantry out the gate. They held their ground, and the cataphracts, who were a large part of this army, charged and dealt heavy casualties. Then, the Mongols, you guessed it, they retreated. The cataphracts chased them. God damn it, the cataphracts chased them until they were lured toward a nearby forest where 10,000 hidden Mongols, those extra provided by Chinggis Khan and unaccounted for by the Georgians, emerged. 5,000 circled the cataphracts with Subutai, while 5,000 circled the infantry who were simply sitting ducks. As the arrows knocked, recurved bows and strings sang, chaos ensued. King George himself, as more than half an Elanian, was a horse archer, and a damn good one at that trade. But these 5,000 approaching him now were all just as good as him, if not better. George would learn the true power of this deadly combination as the irony hit him square in the chest. In the heat of the slaughter, an arrow found its way through King George Lash's bright armor, perhaps one from Jebe himself, as it somehow did not kill the king on the spot, even though it had lodged itself in his chest. In utter horror, Ivan Zakarian watched as the kid who he had helped become king and still helped, and whose life he was supposed to protect by law and by promise to his mother, was helplessly wounded. He called the retreat, and without him there, I'm not sure anyone, king included, would have made it back to Tbilisi. A large part of the infantry and the entire heavy cavalry force were deserted to save the king and stragglers. Somehow Ivan and George both made it back. In his greatest effort yet, he had once again saved the young King George's life, at least for the time being. The arrow was taken out. The king was in pain, but he did not bleed out. King George was a man of immense strength. He could take an arrow to the chest, perhaps better than the average man. But this was still an arrow wound, chest likely blown open to some degree, in the year 1222. Yeah, the royal doctors were gonna have a handful, or their hands in him, and festering his wounds. But then a miracle happened. King George actually started to recover. A Bagrationi is hard to kill, unless you have poison. After King George had taken an arrow for his country, these men from the east, these horsemen, these barbarians who killed without mercy or care, simply left. Yeah, that's right. After Subutai had dismantled an empire that had been built through 2 centuries of rich history in literally 3 years, he just fucking left. He shot their king. He did a drive-by. He shot King George and he left. Georgia was on its knees, still managing to hold itself together, but with 2 armies wiped out in 2 years. They were practically helpless. Probably preparing to meet the Savans high up in the safety of their mountains. All Subutai wanted was the ability to freely pass through the Caucasus without threat, and he only had to exterminate a few armies to get what he asked for. When the reconnaissance in this mission actually started becoming a reconnaissance and not a massacre, Subutai hired the wrong local to tell him where he was going. This one guy probably caused more casualties to the Mongolian army than the Georgians did themselves. But who knows? This random guy led the Mongols through the interior of the Caucasus and just left them stranded there. No map, nothing. When the Mongols finally emerged on the other side of the Greater Caucasus, after months, demoralized and hungry, another army waited for them. Two of Georgia's most trusted vassals, Alania and Circassia, would join forces with Cuban Kipchaks, among others. This coalition army was one born from the steppe, not unlike their tired opponent. But it didn't matter. Subutai and Jebe beat this coalition as well. Perhaps the last real chance the world had to stop the early Mongol conquest evaporated. The Mongols kept going north, towards the lands of the Rus, far enough away for Georgia to finally put its guard down. The eastern part of the empire was thoroughly looted up to Tbilisi, and currently revolting, while the western half did remain unmanned, but untouched. The Georgian Empire was not dead yet. Neither was their king. There was still time to rebuild, just as the Georgians had done so many times before. And that's exactly when the Cuman Kipchaks, or what was left of them, invaded, breaking their near 100-year alliance. In reality, the Cumans were thrown to the wind. While some settled in Georgia, as they had before, others in Hungary and beyond that, this particular group decided to mop up Mongolian leftovers in Georgia. With the king still well into his recovery, Ivan Zakarian was given a solo mission to find these rogue Kipchaks, and at the very least, drive them from the empire. The nomads had taken a similar route as the Mongols and ended up in northern Armenia, when they finally found some proper resistance. But it wasn't Ivan. Instead, it was one of his own bannermen with a local militia he had scraped together. Grigor Kakhbagian defended Ganzak, and after his small force gave them all they were worth, eventually killed and their commanders were captured. The Kipchaks were very much so not above torture, and that's just what they did to the leaders of this resistance. For Grigor himself, who was head of his family, he was dragged naked behind the horses on thorns until he died, and sometime after that. This wasn't done so much as a threat as it was a clear message. The Mongols, like the Huns of antiquity, had created a new age of steppe, a new age of forceful migration, and all the bloodshed that came with such a momentous thing. Ivan did catch up to the Kipchaks, and he did manage to secure at least one victory, but he could not save Grigor Kakhbakian, nor could he save his king any longer, despite half a lifetime's worth of effort. By this point, King George had lingered on for nearly half a year. His wounds were healing, at first, but then infection had set in. Even nearing his deathbed, George was preparing for the eventual return of the Mongols. He needed to rescue the east of his empire. If Shirvan fell, the east was gone. George and his royal entourage left Tbilisi for Baku for a wedding between the Shirvan Shah and King George's own sister. But they only made it as far as Bhagavan, Armenia, before he died from infection from his arrow wound, joining Shah Muhammad II of the Khwarezmian Empire on a growing list of monarchs killed by the Mongolian Empire. He passed away exactly 10 years to the day that his mother and the previous monarch of Georgia, Tamar Mepe, had died. I am not making this stuff up. January 18th of 1223. That cannot be a coincidence. But what does it mean? He was the first king of Georgia to die from battlefield wounds, and that certainly was no coincidence either. He joined his greatest ancestors and was buried in Gelati Monastery, carving out his own legacy just as he had always wanted to among these many acclaimed forefathers. Say what you will about King George IV Lascia Bagrationi morally. He was not an evil king, and I'll say it again. He was the bravest man in the room and remained that even when the Mongols themselves were at the gates. His sacrifice and that of the many soldiers that stood beside him were the only thing that kept the sun above Tbilisi bright and radiant, and from a maelstrom of Mongolian arrows. In his lifetime, Lasha kept the Georgian world illuminated. If you'd like to support this stoic historian, feel free to do so on Patreon for as little as $1 a month, and join Derek Clark, Savaclio Nazarian, Taj Guilford, Nickmate Vossian, Lazarus Dykos, Dave J, Dalinar, and Moist Lord, or become a YouTube channel member like Derek Clark again, Donald Vincent. What? Why? Nickmate Vossian again, G.O.D, Heath Dion, Carl Brandy, and Layla, G.O.K, and John Fritz. Thank you guys for supporting the channel. I appreciate it.